Let's start. We're going to have a two-part uh, discussion tonight. First, Mike is going to begin with a strategic briefing centering on the world-shaking developments that have been going on in the Mideast for the past days, culminating today in a huge heads of state meeting in Egypt. And we'll have discussion of that and other issues which people think are important should be raised. And then we'll move on. After that discussion, we'll move on to the second part, which will be that Promethean Action for the second time has sent a delegation to Washington, which met with congressmen, congressional aides, senatorial aides, all last week, and returned to home base around the country over the weekend. So they will be on the line reporting on what happened, and I'm sure there will be a tremendous interest in those reports. They're very important, followed by discussion. So that's our two-part agenda. So with that, let me bring on Mike.
Thanks, Tony. Welcome, everyone. So quite a historical day. If you've watched any of the footage of Trump in the Knesset when he spoke in Israel, or the various kind of press conferences and the kind of lengthy speech in Egypt, you get a sense that there were dozens of nations participating. Heads of state came there largely to honor the agreement, to support it. One of our colleagues today compared this kind of morale and joy and celebration to the famous treaty that ended the really almost nearly 100 years of warfare in Europe, the religious war of Protestants and Catholics and princes versus kings and all the various divisions that existed in Europe. But it was a religious war, and that treaty was known as the Treaty of Westphalia. And it really brought us into, when that treaty was signed, it ended an era of constant warfare, constant destruction, constant anguish and anxiety from the general population as this war was fought out to the benefit of no one, really. And you can say very much the same with not just the Israel and Palestine-Gaza war, or just Israel and Palestine conflicts that go back decades or centuries, or as Trump references in some ways, millennia, the disagreements. But it's also the broader era of war that the United States participated in with Iraq I, then Iraq II, the kind of post 9/11. You had then Obama's support for Al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks in places like Syria and in Libya and in Egypt. And so it's been decades of broader war in this region that, without a doubt, were intended by globalist networks to incite and create a world war. I was personally at an event where Lyndon LaRouche, our founder, was speaking in 2011, towards the end of the year. It was right after Gaddafi. Right after Gaddafi was killed. If people remember, he was kind of hunted down by the networks that kind of that were backed and overthrew the government, that later then ended up killing Ambassador Chris Stevens, and the whole compound in Benghazi was under attack. These people had chased Gaddafi down and then shot and assassinated him. And it was a bit of a shock, because when Saddam Hussein was found in Iraq, there was a trial, and a bit of a show trial, but it was a trial that eventually led to his execution. And the question came up at that time, why did the Western intelligence agencies, there was the French President Sarkozy, who really pushed for the invasion of Libya. This was Obama's foreign policy. This was the kind of Arab Spring kind of, color revolutions in North Africa, from Syria and Egypt into Libya. And so their question was, why did the Western powers at that time, why did they allow for Gaddafi just to be killed? Why didn't they go through the appearance of democracy, appearance of rule of law, and so on? And his response will never leave me. And it was that these wars are escalating rapidly. He says the war in Libya, the process in Libya, the overthrow of Gaddafi could not be postponed at all. It had to be rushed because you have to overthrow the government of Syria. And the ultimate intention, this is in 2011, the ultimate intention was to launch a war, to create such a conflict in the Levant and north of the Levant in the Caucasus Mountains, what we think of Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, to unleash war in this region that ultimately would end up with a war with Russia. That they were looking, the British geopolitical outlook of the globalists were looking to foment a world war between the United States and Russia. And that's why Gaddafi was killed and slaughtered like a pig in the gutter. And that's why they pushed aggressively. And this is happening soon after Obama and this intelligence community, the same deep state that tried to overthrow President Trump, supported the Morsi Muslim Brotherhood election in Egypt. So I say all of that just to give people a sense that, one, the remarkable foresight of Mr. LaRousse, because it was 2 years later that the coup in Ukraine took place under Obama and Biden, with Hunter Biden there on the board of Burisma, and looked to foment an explicit war in Ukraine with Russia. And we obviously are sitting in that context. So to say then that this dynamic of war in the Middle East is simply a war in the Middle East, it was part of a broader geopolitical agenda to foment a kind of ongoing religious conflict and ultimately a world war between the two largest global nuclear superpowers. And this has been British foreign policy intent since no later than the end of World War II. That there's no way they could tolerate these dominant power of Russia in Europe and the dominant power of the United States across both the Atlantic and the Pacific, with the United States explicitly opposed to the British colonial empire in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma, all over Africa, in Singapore, that this British Empire was no longer going to be operational with the United States now dominance in the world after World War II. British policy was put the United States and Russia against each other and blow up the Middle East as a point of tension and conflict that could quickly spread. So that's the environment. Yes, it's 2 years of a Gaza war, but it is much, much more a single major component of a British and global geopolitical intent to destroy the major powers like the United States and Russia in a global conflict, rather than lose their power and control in the world. And this is a huge moment. And this is not, there are cynics all over the media, some very, very bright people. Bright, and I have such respect for them that I won't even mention their names, but they are so cynical that they were up till today still saying, I don't know what they've said tonight, but up till yesterday still saying, well, this is just like the ceasefire in January, and then that stopped because Trump just backs the Israelis and the Zionists, and they're going to go back to war, and they're going to go back to destruction. And there's no sense at all of the level of engagement that's taken place. I mean, so many people, Trump pointed it out today, so many people ignore the fact that they say Israel is going to dominate the entire region. All of the Jews control the country, the Jews control the world, the Zionists control everything, and we're allowing them to become the dominant empire in the Middle East. And it's like, well, I don't know what the size of the Saudi army is, or the UAE or Qatari or Oman. I'm sure they're not, Bahrain. I'm sure they're not very large. Iraq and Syria are very unstable. Lebanon's been unstable for decades. But Turkey is the second largest military power in all of NATO. So the idea that somehow Israel is just this kind of, and of course Iran's military power was up to the match, certainly in the 12-day war with Israel. So these people obsessed over Israel and the Zionists and the Jews, and some people on this call may fall into that camp, and I understand the perspective, but I think we have to see that it's a much, much more complicated and different world, with the center of it being the globalists operating off of a British geopolitical playbook. And Trump brought in the Turks, their head of intelligence, the Egyptians, the Qataris. The Turks and Qataris were very close to the networks that were used in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya. And the reason why I say all of this is because what Trump has pulled off and what this uniquely American foreign policy has pulled off is akin to the Treaty of Westphalia. There are so many factions. All of these countries have probably been on various sides in opposition to one another over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades. Throughout the Persian Gulf, Middle East, Arabic countries, Levant, up through Turkey, North Africa, there have been all different kinds of factions and involvements. But one thing stands out, is that much of this process has become inflamed in this region since the end of the 1960s and turn into the 1970s. At the same time that the globalists got their claws into the United States, when Nixon was basically under a coup and under duress of the Watergate CIA-run coup, and the pressure came down to take the dollar off gold and open up the globalization era. The same thing was happening in the Middle East. After World War II, many of these nations had never existed. And it was after World War II that a project of Arab nation building had begun, where the colonial eras of British involvement in Egypt or British involvement in many of these places was no longer going to be a dominant controlling force. And there were movements and political leadership which were emerging, some which we probably wouldn't agree with, but that the overall sentiment of the region, and of course, and it was affected by this Cold War split, without doubt, but there was a commitment to build strong nations. That there was a nation-building project, not the liberal, we go and build their nations for them, we bring them democracy, not that guise of kind of liberal imperialism, but the actual real nation building by the people of these countries to build strong and sovereign nations. The very essence of what the United States, as a nation, as a foreign policy, and as a culture after World War II intended to inspire. In South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, in Africa, the areas that were dominated by these colonial empires, we were encouraging the growth and vibrancy of nation states, their strength, resilience, and industrial development. The wealth and prosperity of these countries. And at the end of the 6-Day War, which is 1967, the assassination of President Sadat of Egypt, killed by associates tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was ultimately a creation in the 1920s by British intelligence in Egypt that were basically calling for Islamic caliphate and jihad, similar to what we see with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so on. That's where Hamas stems from. This is what Obama backed during his presidency, these same British intelligence networks. That took root. That Islamization, the bringing back of the Islamic caliphate, no longer was it a nation-building project. What was being encouraged and financed and supported by the globalists was an environment of increasing conflict. And the way this was shaped by the globalists, people like Bernard Lewis, the leading British kind of geopolitician, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a leading globalist of the Trilateral Commission, and one of his kind of students and proteges, a guy named Samuel Huntington, was a book Huntington wrote called The Clash of Civilizations, that no longer would we look to create war between nations, as we saw in World War I and World War II, that they would look to override the integrity of nations, and they would look to have conflict and war simply based on ideologies. the ideology of the West versus Islam, the West versus communism. And of course, the West was not a system of nation states. It was, like you see with the European Union, a liberal ideological structure of no value, of no integrity, but just an ideological posture. And this would be the basis of kind of secular liberalism. This would be the basis, or in some cases for others from the more right wing, it would be basically a kind of perverse version of Christianity. Christianity, for the Crusades against Islam in the Holy Land and so on. This was what was whipped up over the last 50 years in the region and in the world. That sense of we're now going to have this perpetual era of massive ongoing conflicts. And the ultimate game was to break down and destroy the major nations like the United States, like Russia. And what we see from President Trump since he came into office, the first location he visited was Saudi Arabia in 2017, the Gulf Cooperation Council, with other nations, Muslim nations like Indonesia and Pakistan attending. So most of the Muslim nations' heads of states convened, and Trump's message was very clear. End the support of this radical Islam and begin to focus on the development of your nations and peoples. A clear call, the same call he made at the United Nations. The future belongs to the patriots, not the globalists. Break from this idea of supporting an Islamic caliphate, of, where you lose the significance of your nations per se, which are, of course, very distinct in many ways, even though they're all, in this case, Arabic and Muslim. But return back to that, to feed and develop your peoples and your countries, and let's build a kind of system of nation states in collaboration for shared economic prosperity. That was the message in 2017. And again, where's the first place President Trump goes again? The Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. And he makes a similar message again, that we have to end this. We have to end this idea that we are going to be pitted in conflict against one another when no one benefits from this. And President Trump did the same thing with Russia. You see a whole new generation, because Russia, in the minds of many Americans who are older, who lived in the Cold War, think of Russia as an ideological monster of atheism and materialism. Of course, when we look in the mirror, we see that atheism and materialism of the Soviets and communists has taken far deeper root inside our culture and in Europe than and it's largely been ripped out into a large degree. Russia looks to return back to, a sense of, a true Russia, a nation, the nation state of Russia and its people, 1,000-year-old nation, not an ideological structure. So the fact that President Trump has put emphasis on that, I think we can take and consider that this sets the context for this deal, and that this deal was then fortified by all of these nations, from Indonesia and Pakistan, which attended, to Turkey, to all of North Africa, to the entire Persian Gulf and Middle East, and many of the heads of states of Europe, almost all of them. I mean, Hungary and I think Slovakia, the head of the United Nations, and had basically came. And yet it was pulled off because Trump took an entirely different approach, and he stabilized it around a question of long-term economic development in the region. It really is a huge deal. We all know that it can seem precarious, and in some ways it is in some ways. But more than anything, what this teaches us, and I think the great lesson for many Americans who are affected by Trump derangements and the revival of Christianity that we see in the United States becomes important. It's not simply, it's because there's a tenderness of heart. That famous saying, if today you hear his voice, harden not your heart. Or blessed are those who hear the voice of God and obey. That now, so that's the scriptural reference. But why is that important? Because the voice of God is not dictated by the experiences of the past. God is not governed by a mechanical process, nor is creation governed by merely the events of the past inevitably becoming the future. The future is created by those who recognize the actual intention and course of God's creation that can be oftentimes totally inconsistent with the most recent past. That there's nothing about the past that governs per se what we can build today in the future. That the potential is in many ways infinite and endless. And that the cynical hearts, the hardened hearts, the Trump derangement hearts are going to be softened today to recognize that maybe things are really possible and that their hearts should be softened. And if they aren't softened, we should look to soften them. We should look to give them a sense that we can build and solve the great problems, because that's what stands out here. It's what stood out in Europe. The Treaty of Westphalia was signed in 1648, and you had an explosion of scientific thought, of philosophical inquiry, of an unleashing of music, of industry, of science, and of technology. Because there was finally this opportunity. These ideas had been building since the golden age of Florence and the golden age of Northern Europe, the Rembrandts and the Da Vinci's and the cathedrals and the paintings and the music development. And so you got Johann Sebastian Bach, you got the Mozarts, you got the breakthroughs in scientific discovery, you got the steam engine and coal mining and the industrial revolution. You got these settlements in the New World that have taken roots in 1620 up in Massachusetts. And now 30 years later, Europe was transforming into a sense of growth and development, and it had a huge impact on now the rate of development of the colonies that became the United States. This is very akin to that. As President Trump told Steve Witkoff, I'd like to get a deal with Iran, but your next step, your next focus is the deal between Russia and Ukraine. And so this is the kind of shifting point for great things to continue to occur. That once you take on perhaps what many think was the most intractable problem, because as much as Russia and Ukraine have been difficult to solve, it's largely been because the European nations have been so had such bloodlust that you couldn't force the peace agreement that was needed. It wasn't nearly as intractable as the Israel and Palestine Gaza situation was. Trump has taken on the most intractable problem and seemingly resolved it almost in a profound transformation of the entire region's dialogue and focus. And people like El-Sisi of Egypt or Erdogan of Turkey, the Emir of Qatar, the King of Saudi Arabia, the various emirates and leadership of the Persian Gulf countries into Iraq, the new leadership in Syria, all of these things have been transformed by a different kind of potential. And as Trump said, to expand the Abraham Accords, which means these nations will come to acknowledge Israel's existence, and Israel will open up a pathway for statehood, at least some kind of autonomy and self-governance, which I think is ultimately what is implied by statehood here for the Palestinians. And that's the question, that the big problems can now, if these intractable, impossible problems can be solved, then what can't be solved? China threatened a rare earth ban of minerals, largely a ban of export, a complete monopolized control of rare earth minerals, basically in the world. Why that happened is a whole different discussion topic. But the questions of a new global trading system, much like we intended to have with the Bretton Woods after World War II, but was never really secured. The re-industrialization of the United States, building the 400 nuclear power plants that Trump called for in the next 25 years. I talked to students on a campus last week, and they said, yeah, but I mean, how long does it take us? How many have we built? We're never going to get that done. I said, what if we launch a wartime-like mobilization and say we've got to build the plants, build the pressure vessel plants, whatever we need to build the plant that can build it, and just start doing it like it was a wartime mobilization, like an arsenal of democracy, 1938, 1939 level of commitment. He said, oh yeah, then we could do it. So it's just solving the problem that is the problem that needs to be solved, which is we're not politically mobilized to get the job done. But we could get the job done if we mobilized effectively. Well, then let's work on the mobilization. It's this kind of commitment, this kind of focus that people start boldly because their hearts are tender towards the future we intend to create and not by the mistakes and sins of the past. It's very much how Trump has operated here. He's pulled off a profound miracle. And there's many more miracles that can stem from this. And I think in some sense, that puts a responsibility on us to create that, to act upon that world, to not fall prey to the past, but to recognize the potential of the future that this kind of new peace agreement in the Middle East represents. So I'm really excited. I'll be on campuses tomorrow, Thursday. Really excited to be on the campuses and engage with young people. This is going to be, I think, have a big impact on that, emotionally, psychologically. Got a big sign that says, Trump, the peace president, blessed are the peacemakers. So we'll have more reports on that next Monday. So what we want to do tonight is maybe take and engage some people's thoughts and questions on this topic, or largely on this topic, what your thoughts are, or just questions maybe related to it. I'll have a chance to respond to those. And then we had 6, 7, 8 organizers go with another 6, 7, 8 activists. So people that are full-time with us for a long time, and then another set of activists from Florida and Alabama and Texas and California and Michigan come with us into Washington. And this is our sense. We're going to take these ideas, we're going to take this strategic discussion, we're going to organize the grassroots, and we're going to organize the actual national political leadership. Top to bottom, we're going to transform the country's political dialogue. And so we have a whole set of reports on that deployment. It was an entire week, hundreds of meetings. Congress was not there. Some members of Congress were there. But that's usually when the cat's away, the mice can talk freely. So we had a lot of loose, wild, free thinking discussions with a lot of people on Capitol Hill. So that's just a flavor. So we're going to take some questions, Tony. I guess people are raising their hands. And then we're going to bring in our organizers for reports. They'll give a montage of those reports. Then we'll get the activists and get their reports. And then we're going to let everybody that's still on the call engage and ask questions and find out how you can join us probably next spring when we go back. So that's what I had to say tonight.